The morning Vivienne Carr walked into Holbrook's Pawn and Trade on Route 9, she had exactly $43 in her checking account and a cardboard box tucked under one arm. She set the box on the counter without looking at the man behind it. "I need to know what these are worth," she said. She hadn't slept. She'd driven 40 minutes from her apartment in Doylestown with the heat broken and the windows fogging over, and she'd had to pull off twice on the shoulder to wipe the glass with her sleeve. The box had sat on the passenger seat beside her like a passenger she didn't want. The man behind the counter, older, gray at his temples, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, reached over and lifted the flap. He didn't say anything at first. Inside were 4 medals, each one resting in its original case. A combat medical badge, a Bronze Star, a Meritorious Service Medal, and at the bottom, in a hinged blue box, her Army Commendation Medal with V device for valor. "These yours?" the man asked. "Yes," Vivienne said. He looked at her for a moment. She was wearing scrub pants and a zip-up hoodie, her dark hair pulled back tight. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago. She'd lost maybe 12 pounds since April, and it showed most in her face. "I'm not really in the business of medals," the man said carefully. "I know. But you buy things that have value. These have value." He set his glasses on his nose and looked more carefully at the Bronze Star citation card tucked inside the case. "Army nurse," he said. "Yes. How long?" 8 years active. 1 deployment to Kandahar." He was quiet again. A television played somewhere in the back of the store, some daytime talk show with a studio audience. A ceiling fan turned overhead, slow and slightly off balance. "What do you need?" he said. "Enough to cover 3 months' rent and keep my car from being repossessed." She said it the way people say things they've rehearsed in the car, flat and controlled, and with no room left for embarrassment. The man took his glasses off again. "Let me get my manager." Vivienne had been a registered nurse for 6 years before she was suspended. She'd worked the cardiac care unit at Weston Regional Medical Center in Bucks County, 12-hour nights, 4 days a week, and she had been good at it. Not just competent, but the kind of good that the younger nurses noticed and tried to learn from. She was the person the attending physicians called when they were worried about a patient and couldn't say exactly why. She was the one who caught the potassium drip set wrong at 2 in the morning and got there before the alarm did. She had also been the one who filed the incident report on February 11th. A patient named Mr. Hollenbeck, 71 years old, admitted for atrial fibrillation, had been given the wrong medication by the night pharmacist. Not a dosing error. The wrong drug entirely. Vivienne had caught it when she went to scan his wristband, and the system flagged the mismatch. She documented everything. She submitted the report to her charge nurse, to the unit manager, and to the hospital's patient safety officer. 2 weeks later, she was called into a meeting and told her performance had been flagged for review. 1 month after that, she was suspended pending investigation. The incident report had been altered in the system. Her original documentation had been replaced with a version that described an ambiguous concern she had allegedly raised verbally. Nothing in writing, nothing time-stamped, nothing that put any specific failure on any specific person. The attending physician listed on Hollenbeck's chart that night was Dr. Fowler. Dr. Fowler was the chief medical officer's brother-in-law. He was also the one who signed off on Vivienne's suspension review. She'd tried to explain this to the HR director, a woman named Patricia Nole, who had looked at Vivienne across a conference table with an expression so carefully neutral it must have taken years to perfect. "The documentation we have on file doesn't support that characterization," Patricia Nole had said. Vivienne had driven home that day and sat in her car in the parking lot of her apartment complex for 40 minutes without getting out. She'd hired an employment attorney in March. He was not expensive, which meant he was not fast, and by June he'd filed 2 motions that had both been answered with delays. She'd been living on savings that were now gone, an FSA account she'd cashed out early and paid the penalty on, and 2 months of loans from her mother that her mother could not actually afford to give. The apartment cost $1,100 a month. Her car payment was $380. Her student loans, deferred now, were still accruing interest somewhere in the background, like a quiet fire behind a closed door. She had $43. The medals were the last thing she hadn't sold. The manager at Holbrook's was a man named Derek Sowen, 50-ish, with a wedding ring and a kind face that he was trying to keep professionally neutral. I'm going to be honest with you, he said, looking at the cases spread on the velvet counterpad. We don't typically appraise military decorations. They don't move like jewelry or instruments. Most people who'd want them are collectors, and collectors are specific. Can you try? I can make some calls, but I'd be doing you a disservice if I implied you'd get anywhere near the sentimental value. I'm not asking for sentimental value, Vivienne said. I'm asking for what they're worth on the market. He looked at her again, and she looked back at him, and whatever he saw in her face made him stop trying to soften it. Give me a few days, he said. She nodded. She started to slide the medals back into the box. That was when the dog put his head on the counter. She heard him before she saw him. A soft, deliberate weight settling against the glass case to her left. And when she turned, she found herself looking at a German shepherd, so still he might have been carved from something. He was in a military working dog harness, dark green with a handle across the back, and he was looking at the medals with an attention she couldn't quite name. Not the frantic interest of a dog that smells food. Something slower. Something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Apollo, said a voice. A man had come from the back of the store, though she hadn't heard the door. He was tall, maybe 35, in civilian clothes. Jeans, a gray thermal shirt, with the kind of build that looked like it had been maintained through discipline rather than vanity. A scar ran along the left side of his jaw, thin and old, the kind you stop noticing after a while if it's your own face. Apollo, come. The dog didn't move. The man walked over, not hurrying, and reached for the handle on the harness. Apollo let himself be touched, let the man's hand settle on his back, but he didn't come. He kept his chin on the counter, his eyes on the medals, and made a sound low in his chest that wasn't quite a whine. Vivienne had worked with military working dogs in Kandahar. She knew what they sounded like when they alerted, and she knew what they sounded like when they were doing something that had no protocol. This was the second thing. I'm sorry, the man said to her and then to Derek Sowen. He's not usually like this. What's his name? Vivienne asked. Apollo. What branch? He looked at her. Navy. You're a handler? Was SEAL? He didn't answer right away. Then, yeah. Apollo had not moved. His chin was still on the counter. His eyes had moved from the medals to Vivienne, and something about being looked at that way by a dog made her throat tighten in a way that nothing in the past 4 months had managed. These are yours? The man asked. He was looking at the cases the way Derek Sowen hadn't, not like a buyer appraising inventory, but like someone reading a language he knew. Yes, she said. He reached out and tilted the blue star case so he could see the citation card. His jaw tightened once. Combat medical badge, he said. Yes, Kandahar. She said nothing. What year? 2017 to 2018. He was quiet for a long moment. Apollo's tail moved once, just the tip, back and forth. Why are you selling them? She looked at the counter. She'd told herself she wasn't going to explain it to anyone here. This was a transaction, not a confession, but she was very tired. She had been tired for a long time. So she told him. His name was Cade Morrow. He sat across from her at a diner table 2 blocks from the pawn shop, a cup of coffee in front of him, and Apollo settled under the table with his chin on Vivienne's foot, which was not something Cade appeared to have directed him to do. Tell me about the report, Cade said. She told him everything. The medication error, the documentation, Dr. Fowler, Patricia Knoll, the way her original report had been quietly replaced with something that sounded like a vague complaint from an emotional employee. She told him about her attorney, about the delays, about the savings she'd run through, and the borrowed money and the $43. Cade listened the way soldiers listen, without the constant, small affirmations civilians feel obligated to make, without nodding on schedule. He just watched her and listened, and when she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Did you keep any of your original documentation? He said. The system record was changed, but I'd emailed the safety officer the same night. Those emails are still in my sent folder. Something shifted in his expression. Does your attorney have them? I forwarded them to him in March. Has he used them? She hesitated. He said they weren't sufficient on their own. Cade looked at the table. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn, then back. You have timestamp data on those emails. The metadata from when the system record was changed would show if it was altered after your original submission. How would I get that? He looked up at her. You probably can't get it yourself. But there are people who can request it, depending on who's asking. She waited. "Give me a day," he said. "You don't know me." "I know what you did in 2017, he said. "Apollo knows it too, apparently." The dog under the table made no sound, but he pressed his chin more firmly against her foot. What Vivienne didn't know, what she couldn't have known from sitting across a diner table from a quiet man in a gray thermal shirt, was who Cade Morrow actually was. She looked him up that night in her apartment, sitting on her mattress with her laptop and the last of a box of crackers. Captain Cade Morrow, United States Navy retired, SEAL Team 6, 3 deployments to Afghanistan, 1 to Iraq, a Silver Star, a Navy Cross, the second highest combat decoration in the U.S. military. A traumatic brain injury from an IED in Helmand Province in 2019 that had ended his career but not, by any apparent measure, his sense of purpose. Apollo had been his working dog in Afghanistan. When Cade was medically retired, he'd petitioned to adopt him. It had taken 14 months and 3 congressional inquiries. He'd gotten the dog in the end. There were no social media profiles. There were news articles from 2020, a brief mention in a Military Times piece about veterans advocating for working dog adoption reform, and a name in the acknowledgments section of a book about PTSD treatment that Vivienne found on a library database at 2 in the morning. She put the laptop down and lay back on the mattress. Apollo had known. She didn't know how. She didn't have a framework for it that didn't sound like wishful thinking. But the dog had put his chin on that counter and looked at those medals, and something had happened that didn't have a clean explanation. And she had learned, in 8 years of nursing and 1 year of hardship, to respect the things that didn't have clean explanations. She closed her eyes. For the first time in a long time, she slept before 2 a.m. Cade called her the next morning. "I need you to send me those emails," he said. "All of them. The original submission and everything after." She did. He called again 6 hours later. "I made some calls," he said. "I have a friend at the Pennsylvania Department of Health and another one who does digital forensics for a law firm in Philadelphia. The metadata on your original incident report submission is recoverable. It's time-stamped, it's attributed to your employee ID, and it was accessed and modified by a user with administrator-level credentials 17 days after you submitted it." The room felt very still. "Can we get that?" she said. "Already started. There's a formal records request going in tomorrow. If the hospital stonewalls it, my contact at the Department of Health has authority to compel disclosure." She sat down on her kitchen floor. She hadn't planned to sit on the floor. It just happened. "Why are you doing this?" she said. There was a pause. "I spent 8 years going into places where people were trying to keep the truth buried," Cade said. "I'm not willing to sit in a pawn shop and watch someone sell their bronze star because the same thing is happening here." She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. "Also," he said, and she could hear something almost like wry in his voice, "Apollo seems to have strong opinions about this, and I've learned to trust his judgment. It took 11 weeks, not 11 days, not the clean resolution of a story where justice moves at the speed of conscience. 11 weeks of records requests and legal filings, and a Department of Health inquiry that expanded in scope once the forensics report was submitted, and the hospital's own IT logs showed 3 separate instances of record modification in the 90 days following Vivienne's original report. The hospital's legal team tried twice to reframe the narrative. They suggested Vivienne had submitted an informal concern, not a formal report. The time-stamped email proved otherwise. They suggested the system modification had been a routine update. The forensics report showed it had been targeted to a single record. They stopped making suggestions after that. Her employment attorney, the not expensive, not fast one, suddenly began moving considerably faster once Cade connected him with a civil rights attorney in Philadelphia who had litigated 3 similar cases against hospital systems in the past 5 years. Dr. Fowler retired in September, which was described in the hospital's internal communication as a personal decision. The chief medical officer issued a statement calling for a review of the incident reporting process. Patricia Knoll transferred to the hospital's sister facility in Delaware, which was not phrased as a demotion but functioned as one. The settlement offer came on a Tuesday. Vivienne was sitting in her attorney's office on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Doylestown. Cade was in the waiting room because she'd asked him to come and then told him he didn't have to come in. Apollo was beside her because the attorney had looked at the dog and then at Vivienne, and then said nothing and let him in. The number on the paper was enough to cover everything she owed, replace the savings she'd spent, and keep her apartment for 2 years while she decided what came next. It also included a formal written acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a commitment to systemic changes in the hospital's incident reporting protocols, which her attorney had fought for specifically and which Vivienne cared about more than the money. She didn't cry in the office. She waited until she was outside on the sidewalk, in the thin October light with Cade standing a few feet away and Apollo pressed against her leg. "You okay?" Cade said. "Yes," she said, which was only partly true and which they both understood. She looked down at Apollo. He looked back at her with the calm, dark attention that had undone her in a pawn shop 3 months ago, and she thought about the morning she'd driven down Route 9 with a box of medals and $43 and the absolute conviction that no one was going to help her. She put her hand on his head. "Good dog," she said quietly. He leaned into her palm. In November, Vivienne went back to Weston Regional. Not to the job, she wasn't ready for that yet, and they had offered reinstatement, but she was still deciding, but to the cardiac care unit on a Tuesday evening to visit a patient she'd been told about through a former colleague. An elderly man, 74, who'd been admitted for congestive heart failure and who had no family listed on his intake form. She brought a crossword book and a thermos of decent coffee because hospital coffee was, in her professional opinion, a public health concern. She sat with him for 2 hours. He was a retired machinist from Allentown named Gilbert Prusso, and he had a dry wit and strong opinions about baseball, and had served in the Army Reserve in the mid-70s, which he mentioned once and didn't belabor. When she stood up to leave, he looked at her. "You work here?" he asked. "I used to," she said. "I'm trying to figure out if I'm going back." "What happened?" She thought about how to answer that. "Someone changed something that shouldn't have been changed," she said. "And then some people helped put it right." He nodded, slowly, the way old men nod when they've heard enough versions of the story to understand the shape of it. "You going to stay in nursing?" he asked. She thought about 12-hour nights and the potassium drip she'd caught at 2 in the morning, and Mr. Hollenbeck, who had gone home in March without knowing how close it had been. "Yeah," she said. "I am." She took the settlement and used a portion of it to file a formal complaint with the Pennsylvania State Board of Nursing that specifically documented the alteration of hospital records as a patient safety issue, not just an employment dispute. Her civil rights attorney co-signed the filing. The complaint triggered an audit. The audit found 2 other incident reports in the same unit that had been modified in the system after submission, both within the past 18 months, both in cases where the original report had named attendings in the CMO's orbit. Those cases were reopened. Vivienne didn't attend the hearings. She wasn't asked to. Her documentation was sufficient, the forensic records were submitted, and the rest of it moved through channels she didn't need to monitor anymore. She heard about the outcomes secondhand, the way you hear about a storm that came through while you were somewhere else, the shape of it, the damage, the fact that it had finally passed. She went back to work in December, not at Weston Regional. She'd decided against that in the end, not from bitterness, but from a clear-eyed assessment that the unit needed people who hadn't been inside the situation, who could rebuild trust without the weight of what had happened. She applied to the cardiac care unit at Jefferson University Hospital in Philadelphia, 40 minutes from her apartment, and was hired in 2 weeks. The nurse manager there, a woman named Darlene Hatch, who had been in cardiac nursing for 22 years, shook Vivienne's hand on the first day and said, "I read about what you did." "Both things." Vivienne looked at her. "Kandahar," Darlene said, "and the rest of it." Vivienne nodded once. "Don't shrink," Darlene said. "This unit needs people who don't shrink." She went to work. The medals are back in the blue boxes. They're in the top drawer of the dresser in her bedroom, in her apartment in Doylestown, which she has been able to keep. She doesn't look at them often. They're not the kind of thing you take out and think about on ordinary evenings. But she knows where they are, and that's different from where she was in June when she'd placed them in a cardboard box and driven 40 minutes in the cold because she hadn't been able to think of another option. Cade texts her sometimes, usually about nothing much, a news item, a question about a restaurant near her that Apollo apparently disapproved of on a walk, a photograph of the dog looking personally offended by a squirrel. She texts back. It's easy in the way that things are easy when they're built on something solid. Apollo is doing well. He has, as far as Vivienne can tell, no memory of the pawn shop, or if he does, he keeps it to himself. He is a dog who lives entirely in the present tense, in the walk that is happening now, and the hand that is on his head now, and the next thing, whatever it is. She thinks there is a lesson in that, though she's not entirely sure what it is yet. She's still working it out. She goes to work at 7 in the morning, 3 nights a week and rotating weekends, and she is the person the attending physicians call when they are worried about a patient and can't say exactly why. She catches things. She documents them. She submits the reports. She does not look over her shoulder. She has learned that the record of a thing is not the thing itself. That what actually happened on February 11th in the cardiac care unit of Weston Regional Medical Center is not stored in any hospital database or legal filing or settlement agreement. It lives in the fact that Gerald Hollenbeck went home in March, in the audit that reopened 2 cases that deserved reopening, in whatever the next nurse will find it slightly easier to do, in a system that is slightly less able to bury the truth because of what she did and refused to let be undone. The medals are in the drawer, but the thing they stand for is not something that can be pawned.